So all this was going on, and in the middle of this, we were publishing our own magazine, World War III Illustrated, and trying to do political comics, and working on that. And the squatters movement emerged in the neighborhood as some way that I felt I could have a positive interaction with the neighborhood, because there were all of these abandoned buildings, and the city wanted to make them into market rate housing. Local organizations had come to a compromise saying they would be 50% market rate housing. And the squatters said, to hell with that, we're just going to seize these buildings, and none of it's going to be made into market rate housing. And that seemed to be a very dynamic movement that I wanted to support. And so I did get involved first in supporting the squats, and for a short period of about 4 years or so, I was a house member in one squatted building. And that meant participating in weekly work days, paying a monthly rent, participating in the defense of the building, and in exchange you got a space in the building. That was a big experience for me. It was like a huge moment in my life, I think in a lot of people's lives. Those years, 1988 to about 1993, were just amazing years in which there were numerous street confrontations in the neighborhood, either because the police were trying to evict the squats, or because they were trying to curfew the park, or they were attacking homeless people, or they were enforcing some other ridiculous idea that the community rejected. There was a real sense of almost a local militia aspect, where people on the block or people in the neighborhood would get together and form a group and go do something very spontaneously, not purely spontaneously. There were mechanisms of organizations. There was a phone tree. There were people who had enough credibility that they could call people together to do something. But still, there was a sense of people just, hey, let's go do this, and everybody would go, and that kind of, there was a really brutal crackdown that crushed that sensibility. The park was, Tompkins Park here where we are, was very much a center of activity. Starting with an attempt to curfew the park in 1988, where they tried to pose a 12 o'clock curfew on the park, and people resisted that. There was a night-long street battle, and after that the government actually gave in and said, okay, we'll lift the curfew. And so there was this amazing sense that, we could actually make policy on the street corner, as opposed to making the policy through the political process, which had become very frustrating for people. That continued for a number of years, and then there was this huge crackdown on the park, where the park was actually fenced off for an entire year with a 2-story fence went all the way around the park, a 1-story fence. And large police presence, usually 30 police assigned every day to watch that fence. And that was followed by some squatter evictions in which a tank was used actually to sort of show who was boss. The police actually brought in a tank. And at the end of that process, really 10 years down the road, about 13 of the squats were legalized. There'd been about 30 at the beginning, so more than half were evicted. The discussion of what type of incomes people had in the squats was a favorite topic of liberals, who were always saying, well, you aren't all really poor enough to be doing this. And what I found was there was a fair mixture of people. I remember there was one guy who actually owned an airplane, but there were people who came off the street and really had nothing. There were people who were in college. There were people who had 9-to-5 jobs. There were people who were sort of outside of society in some way, and this was a society that they could function with, you know, for whatever reason, that when they tried to be in normal jobs or normal apartment situations, they just fucked them up. They couldn't handle the paperwork. They could deal with someone who was their friend coming in and asking them for rent, but they couldn't deal with putting a rent check in the mail and sending it to a landlord. There are people like that. And this was the one society where they found safety. There were people who were quite extreme, and this was the place where they could be extreme. So there was a real mixture of people, and I think that was true of the neighborhood as a whole, that there was a real mixture of people. I think that the main argument that liberal and progressive people who were anti-squatter would make was the squats are not 100% low-income housing. But if you look at what they have built in the neighborhood, they're all, you know, they're all like 60-40, 80-20. They're saying they have an 80-20 plan. They're building a building and 20% of it will be low income and 80% will be market rate. This is everything they've built for the last 30 years in this neighborhood. So in a lot of ways, they were the pot calling the kettle black there, that obviously you need some capital base for a project. Somebody has got to have some bread. You know, if nothing else, to buy the other guy cigs. You know, somebody there's got to have some bread. And you're never going to have a project that's 100% low income that actually works unless it's got a very strong parent organization that's probably state connected. And there weren't even such organizations coming out of the liberals in the 70s, 80s, 90s. That had all been scrapped. You know, real social service programs haven't happened in this country since the 60s. You know, so that argument was made, and I think it was false.